to Kümneger Talks. I'm your host, Selam, Abebe. Today's podcast is titled, Seriously Though, Where Are You From? Neither Here Nor There. In this podcast, we will explore the architecture of subjectivity, place, time, and space. Let's jump right in.
No, it's funny, like Mary, when you're like talking and describing what this is going to be about, I was smiling to myself because I don't know if Selam told you, but I just spent 2 months traveling, and a month of which was spent in Africa, just literally going from country to country to country. I went to Ethiopia and Kampala and so Uganda and Eritrea, just collecting my family's stories. When that question, where are you really from, is one that I've spent the summer trying to answer, because I grew up I'm Eritrean, but I grew up in the Ethiopian community. My parents are, I guess the term was Amiche. They were born and raised in Ethiopia, and they left during the Derg regime. But then when they came back in 98 to visit my mom's parents, they came at the worst time, because that's when all the deportations were happening. But because of the time they left at, they always that was a huge part of their identity. But then, just traveling around, Africa and listening to everything my family went through during that time, I just really, I think I maybe kind of developed this aversion to that Ethiopian identity, because I can't claim that country, because I just the way especially my uncle, if you read the piece, then he spent he's still waiting for his papers. He's his mental health is in the gutter. When I look at him, I can't claim the country that I used to claim. I can't claim Ethiopia anymore. So it's but then I don't speak Tigrinya. And I grew up in the Ethiopian community. And it's just where am I really from? I still I'm Eritrean, but it's a hybrid identity, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And whether or not I like it, I listen, I listen to Amharic music. A lot of my friends are Ethiopian. So that's still a large part of my identity, but it's complicated. I went to 3 different countries. I traveled around Africa for a month, and I still couldn't answer that question, but I don't know that there's a definitive answer,
What do others think about that?
I think it's beautiful. I think trying to search for who you are and where you're from and your ancestry is a lifelong process. And hearing you talk about the journey, I'm sure it's confusing and but also a really nice thing, right? I also had the privilege of seeing your photos and some of your thoughts along the way. And it's a really beautiful thing, I think. And I said this in a previous podcast, but I grew up a very proud Eritrean person and from a very proud Eritrean family. And I think for me, that has never changed, and that has always been my identity. But grappling with what it means to be Black in North America has been kind of a really interesting journey for me. And now fiercely identifying as a Black woman, in addition to my Eritreanness, for me is in my young adulthood, and less so of my upbringing. As a kid, if you asked me what are you or where are you from or how to identify, I would have been Eritrean. But now I would say a Black Eritrean woman, and I think that for me has been my own journey.
My experience is different. So in terms of thinking about where are you really from, when I think about it in terms of my life stage, I asked that question in my elementary school and middle school years, never after high school. So, that was when I first came to Canada, where I was receiving comments telling me, you're very Caucasian-like, you're very Asian-like because of certain things I liked. And that was the time when I was really searching for things to hang on to the Ethiopian community or to the Absha community. Things at the micro level, the household, language, food. The more meso macro level was, cross-country running. Anything to do with sports. Yeah.
I guess I can kind of relate to Harmona in a sense, because my mom was Eritrean, but also her family was raised in Ethiopia and spent most of their time in Ethiopia and everything. So I never really learned the language. It was Amharic that was spoken in the house, and there is so much overlap in the cultures, and I guess I also like, I don't know if I can at this point, but I could have pled ignorance in a way to like understanding like the nuance and all of the context and everything like that. But yeah, it was, I don't know, I guess it's because I would imagine it's because like the majority of the people that were around were Ethiopians. So I feel like that was just the dominating language and culture in a sense, because there are definitely things I guess that are separate about the culture too. And in terms of the context of being in Canada, I definitely identify as a Black person, as well as an Abasha, but I don't know if like it was so like predominant in my upbringing, like thinking about these sorts of things, just because I grew up in a very like multicultural community. And so everybody was like from everywhere. So I didn't really specifically think of myself as Black. I just thought of myself as like Ethiopian or Eritrean, like Abasha. So I kind of count myself, I guess, privileged in that way, because I would imagine there's a lot of people who didn't get the chance to kind of think of themselves so specifically and had to think of themselves very broadly just because of kind of what was put on them. But yeah, I guess that's different now, just because I'm more aware of how people can perceive me from the outside looking in, without understanding the nuance, without understanding that Blackness is not just one gigantic thing.
David, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's sort of been a little bit of a theme so far in the conversations that we've been having. And I was wondering how others feel precisely about this particular comment that Fabian made, the ways in which on a larger mainstream societal level, for example, and even in policy, the category Black, for instance, shows up in a very homogenized type of way, and in what ways that might have impacted your experiences growing up here, or in Adam's case, at whatever point you came in here, and in what ways that sort of inform your experiences, advance your experiences, or perhaps maybe might have interrupted your own process of discovery, and so on and so forth. So I was just wondering how that, if that at all had any impact on you, if it did, in what ways, and if it didn't, why not, I guess.
I think I'm gonna just jump in, but like, how many of you, like growing up, like were told, you're not Black, you're Ethiopian, you're Eritrean? Like, how many of you heard that from your parents? Like, yeah, right? Like, I think it was just like that's, so Fabian and Terhas's comments just made me think, for example, Terhas, like you, like, I think we're having our journeys in reverse in a way where like, you were like very like Eritrean. Now you're like, no, I'm a Black Eritrean woman. Whereas like, yeah, like I'm that, but like, I think for a long time, just resisting, like I identified more with like just like being a Black Canadian woman, and then now I'm discovering like my culture and my traditions and whatnot. But like it was, I think it was confusing. It complicated how I viewed on an unconscious level, how I viewed myself, and and what race meant to me, because you have there's my mom who just claims Ethiopia no matter what. She says, nobody can take Ethiopia away from me. I don't care if I was deported. Like, I'm Ethiopian, like, so there's like my mom who says, you're not, growing up, you're not Black, you're Ethiopian. But then there's when I would go to my grandparents' home, my grandma would speak to me in Tigrinya, and I wouldn't understand. She'd be like, how do you not know your own language? I remember saying I'm Ethiopian, and then she would just go, ugh, and just like it would like, no offense, but it would like disgust her, like she would be like, frustrated with that. So I think whatever conversations I had earlier on in my life, like complicated it to the extent that like I literally, just like I said at the very beginning of the podcast or recording, that I spent just like a month traveling around trying to like untangle these knots, trying to figure out like what my identity is, you know? So like if whatever conversations happened didn't at all clarify anything. I don't know if that answers it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because like for me, I think growing up Eritrean first, and then I'll get to the Black part in a minute and to your question, Mary. Like I think being Eritrean in the 90s and early 2000s was very much centered around the struggle against Ethiopia. So our identity was very much like this juxtaposition of like who we are is what we're not, right? Of like kind of like that Canadian American, you know, complex. And a lot of it, I will say, I can't speak for other Eritreans, is like fueled by like pride and all these beautiful things that I'm super proud of, and I can go on and on about my people and my history, but also like an anger and a very deep like resentment and frustration, and like that comes from war, and that comes from these like devastating effects. And so I think for growing up that way, there was so much anger around being like, this is who I am, this is what I'm not. And like to this day, I still get mad. Like if you come to me with a Maringa and you don't even ask me what I speak or who I am, I will be like, excuse me, like my parents do, right? Like I still have some of those triggers, I'll be honest. But at the same time, I recognize that like as I've gotten older, like I am looking for more solidarity than, you know, than reasons to be angry, for lack of a better word. And so I feel like that solidarity comes not just with like other Habeshas or other people from the Horn or East Africa. It also comes from like, you know, this desire to connect with other people who share my experiences, you know. And so one of my best friends, for example, is Tamil, and the experience of Tamils in Sri Lanka, India, is not that much different than, you know, what we experience in Eritrea and Ethiopia. And so like, and they're dark skinned as well, right? So obviously not Black per se, but I have this like kind of desire to be like, okay, what are these struggles that are connecting us? Like what is similar between our different experiences? Because I grew up very much like, we're different, we are unique, we need to protect fiercely who we are. Kind of like Quebecers, honestly, that's another story. But, you know, we need to protect our language, we need to protect our identity, we need to protect all of these things. And so in doing that, we need to reject everything else and make sure that we're distinct. And so I think I'm kind of moving away from that a little bit, while still, of course, like super proud of my upbringing and who I am and all of those things. And so being Black for me now is like looking for that solidarity amongst other people who experience what I experience. And just on my last note, Fabian, what you said, very much so, being plunged into an all-white neighborhood and an all-white high school where there's only a few Black students, like, and those girls became my friends, like, and, you know, they're African as well, and that helped. But, you know, like, obviously now we have these shared experiences that have nothing to do with being Habesha, but have everything to do with being Black or African. And so I think that's kind of been my experience moving forward. So I totally get what you're saying, Hermana, and you too, Fabian.
I think I had mentioned this in a previous conversation, but it's definitely a different experience when you don't have that kind of multiculturalism to lean on, I guess, because like David was in a similar situation where he was raised in a predominantly white area, so he like basically stuck out like a sore thumb, and there was just like no education around the idea of like being Black meaning more than one thing, meaning more than like a rapper or NBA player or something like that. So I also think like being kind of I guess lighter toned, or I guess more like racially ambiguous. Like for sure now people will look at me and like, you know, kind of assume that I'm Black or like mixed with Black. But I just like growing up, a lot of times people just did not know kind of what category to put me in. It's like just like looking from the outside in. So I think that also is like, I guess, another way in which I probably wasn't like so much boxed into a specific definition of being Black, I guess.
So for me, I don't really differentiate, at least in my young age. I never really differentiated between being Black and being, Abesha or Ethiopian. They were affiliated for me, and I did grow up in a very multicultural area. Those of you who've been in Ottawa, if you know the Vanier area, that's where I grew up in Ottawa. Lots of Somalians and Arabs and people from South Asia. So those comments I mentioned earlier about, being white or being too Asian because my liking of hockey or classical music was mostly from my Somalian and Arab friends. But to sort of, reclaim that Black or Ethiopian identity, as I mentioned earlier, would be the language, speaking at home, the cooking, the food, going to church with Black people, Ethiopian church, or Eritrean church. So yeah, I never really differentiated them. It's a sort of, I guess you can say, it's a homogenized definition for me. I don't separate it out.
What about your family? Like, did your family, I know somebody asked that question earlier, I think it was Hedwana. Like, I didn't, my parents never gave me that, like, you're Habesha, not Black, but I did hear it from others. Like, was your family like that too, or no?
I mean, my mom did when I told her about those comments, but, I didn't really pay attention to her at that point. To me, it was the same thing. If I'm Habesha, I'm Black. If I'm Sub-Saharan African, I'm Black. That was it. It wasn't really a point of arguing. I don't know where she was coming from. I don't know what her lens was to make that point, but yeah, I didn't see it that way.
I think for me, like in, how do I say this? Like in Canada, in a white space, in a white country, like a white person looking at you sees a Black person, right? They're not going to say, oh, you're from here or from here or whatever. But like, at least for me on the individual level, like I am like a Black woman in a white society, but I know where I'm from. And that's a privilege that people, like Black Canadians or like Black Caribbeans who found themselves where they found themselves because of the transatlantic slave trade. They have their history, they have their culture, they've built it, but I can say exactly like generations back where everybody, like I sat down with my grandfather in Asmara and I said, who's your father? Who's your father's father? Where are they from? And I wrote it all down. And I did that with my mother's father too. And I know the story, and I know the history. And that sort of just gives you this sort of like, it grounds you in this sort of like confidence of whatever this society tries to tell me I am, I know exactly where I'm from. So I'm not going to buy the lies, Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I actually, it's so funny you say that because we had a previous conversation where we were talking about, Habeshas, whether or not they're actually Black or whatever, and that is totally my response, like, all the time. Like I can trace back my genealogy to hundreds of years back, like continues onward forever. I know exactly where I'm from. And there is like a source of power and strength and pride in that. Absolutely. In a way that, I do think about our Black ADOS, African descendants of slaves, brothers and sisters, that they're not able to do that. And like, and so I empathize with like their experience and how it differs from ours and why sometimes they want to draw that line in the sand in terms of like what it means to be Black, or at least what it means to be a descendant of slave and not. But at the same time, like I said, we know who we are, where we're from, and we're from Africa.
Saying what you said, Hermona, and further supported by Terhas, knowing that, having that grounding that you talked about. So, the way I heard it is, if someone knows who they are and what they are, it's incredibly difficult to try to tell them otherwise, right? Mm-hmm. How do you show up in society? How does that sort of, make you show up in society? And is there, I guess, a difference in the way in which people relate with you based on that?
I think how do you show up in society? I think to a certain extent, we're all subject to others' perceptions, right? So I know who I am, I know where I'm from, but to a certain extent, let's say like I'm in a white space, there's like a sort of like, you have to remember how you're being perceived, and you have to like, it's survival, like you act accordingly. But to a larger extent, like, again, I repeat myself, but like there's that grounding and confidence. Like you're just like, I just perceive me however you want to perceive me. I'm going to play the game to survive. But again, I know who I am and I know where I'm from. So whatever confusion you might feel about who I am and where I'm from, I'm not confused on your level, you know? So it's kind of like I'm on unshakable ground, you know, like you play the game to survive, but like you just like, you can't make me think I'm something I'm not, you know? Yeah.
No, absolutely. I understand. I guess, what triggered this question is your very powerful response around, I know who I am. And, relationships for the most part, when people see you, for the most part in the beginning are sort of formed on assumptions, right? On what you think the person before you is, right? And so you sort of go through your memory of categories and you say, oh, okay, so this is how this person's presenting. And so here are all the sort of ideas that I have about that. And now let me sort of relate with them on that manner, right? Most people do that. Fair enough, not everybody does that, right? But most people do that. And so I'm wondering, like, when you show up in the way that you show up, which I fully support and wish that was the case for everyone, it's bound to, lack of a better word, maybe sort of shock someone on the other end, because you're not fitting a particular kind of perceived stereotype or accounting of how they believe you should show up, and so therefore how they should relate with you. You're completely outside of how they understand that particular category. Does that make sense? So I guess that's what I was asking. Like, have you ever noticed that, or is that something that maybe you just really didn't pay attention to? And that's fine too if you didn't. And I don't want to put you on the spot, Ramona, in that sense.
No, it's a good question. I'm just thinking now, like I'm going through like my memories, like, yeah.
Because I do wonder, like I've had, and I'm asking because I've had experiences like that, right? So what you shared very much resonates with me in terms of how I understand myself to be, knowing full well that I'm also on that journey, lifelong journey of learning more about my history, my ancestry, my culture, and discovering truths about things that were always hidden about what it means to be Black in this world, not just from inventions, but creations of societies and so on and so forth, and knowledge building, right? So the more you discover, the more truths you uncover, it's bound to impact you and your identity and how you show up. And so you constantly going through a process of recalibration, so to speak, right? So it's a work in progress. It's never really done. And I don't even think that by the time anyone passes away that they've completed all of it, but it's a work in process. And so sort of doing that, and for me, that comes from my own upbringing, right? Like the way my parents raised me, to whom I give all credit to, and further supported by my family, right? Their siblings and so on and so forth. That in the workplace, for example, or various workplaces that I've had, and even in school when I was a student, or even in relationships, you get this thing thrown where it's like, but you're different, right? And so my question becomes, what is so different? Is it like, what exactly are you terming as being different here? Right?
I think I get what you're saying. Are you saying that, like, sometimes in your interactions with white people, they expect you to fit some sort of stereotypical, character of like Blackness, and then you don't, and then they're just confused?
Yeah, and so that's exactly it, right? So for instance, and for you, you described yourself as sort of having that grounding. This isn't to say that others don't, right? But just sort of speaking to the experiences that's being shared here. And what ways does that sort of impact, shape, create a particular kind of an experience in your environment, the back and forth, for instance? And I've gotten this sort of response, not just from white people, to be quite honest with you. It's also come from other racialized people, where it's like, you're not the typical Black, and I don't understand what that means half the time. And so I'm just sort of wondering if that's come up for you or anyone else in this discussion today. And if it hasn't, that's fine. Let's talk about it. If it has, at what points, how, and how do you navigate through that?
I think, I don't know. Like, I don't know if anyone has ever thought that about me. I don't know if they've felt comfortable saying it like to me, like, but I just, no, I don't think I can think of, I remember like maybe kind of doing it to myself growing up, in the sense of like my interest. I was always like more, I remember like in high school, like I was more of like a nerdy, like awkward, bookish type, so, and I never thought, like, I didn't think that like my interests were like the stereotypical, whatever it means, Black interests, but I don't think I've had an experience where someone else sort of like put me in that box.
Mm-hmm.
I've had that experience obviously from friends, but also from myself, as Hermona alluded to. In terms of myself, I was also, the bookish type. I was very nerdy in high school. I loved classical music, and that's where all those comments came from. Are you really Black? No, you're like the whitest Black guy I've ever seen, and stuff like that. And in terms of how I navigated it, I guess I ignored it in a way, by attaching myself to things that I thought were Ethiopian or Irish or Black. That was my main way. Otherwise, I would say my main way was to ignore it.
It's interesting. When I think about your question, Mary, I think back to when I was in middle school or early high school. And at that time I was in Elmer Gatineau. So pretty much one of the 3 Black people in my grade, in my school, probably one of the 5 Black people in my school. And I remember my friend just asking me like, you're not really Black. And I was thinking like, what does that mean? And I was just like, for some reason, and maybe it's the need to like fit in and things like that at such a young age. In this case, I remember saying like, yeah, I'm not Black, I'm Ethiopian, but like, I get what you mean. Like, I can talk Black, like I could like talking about code switching and stuff like that. But then I feel like I was just trying to like still justify like, oh, I know what you mean, and I can still be that way, but I'm actually not Black, I'm Ethiopian. And I think she just got used to me saying like, I'm not Black, I'm Ethiopian, because I would always tell them like things my parents said and stuff like that, just having like this distinction of like how they identify, to a point like all of my friends knew it by like verse. They would always be like, she's not Black, she's Ethiopian. Repeating that to people. So I think it depends on who it is. But like, say for example, if someone else were to say that to me, I guess it would depend on what my relationship is with them. Is it like worth it to even educate them? Or maybe at that point in my life, it's like, am I trying to impress them? Am I trying to like, what am I trying to do? But at this moment, if someone was like, you're not really Black, and I'm like, okay, I'd just be like, okay. Why does that matter? Like, why does your opinion on if I'm Black enough or not matter? What is that going to change in my life? Not really anything. And it just shows their ignorance. And I think that speaks so much more than any part of me or any part of my identity.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, Selam, because I have one of those like core memories too. I think I was in middle school too, and having like white friends say, yeah, you're not really Black. Or was it like, you look Black, but you don't act Black? It was something like that, but it like always stuck with me. Like, and there was very much a sense of like, now obviously I can put words to it, of like devaluing whatever it means to be Black, whatever they had perceived is Black. Like something about that was like, well, you're not that, like you're better than that. And that, I think that's what always stuck with me. It was like, well, why do you need me to be better than whatever it is you think is Black? And I think that always kind of bothered me. And it's funny because like I have a father who kind of always, like, it's sort of similar to what you said, Aaron, like it was interchangeable, like yes, you're Black, you're Eritrean as well, you know, you're Habesha as well. And I was thinking about it while you were talking. I think it's because my dad's very old, like he's in his like mid 70s, and he very clearly remembers like Italian colonization of Eritrea. Like he experienced it, he speaks Italian fluently, like very much remembers it. And he very much remembers being perceived as Black, right? Like he was Black to the Italians, right? That's how they treated us. Like, yes, we were Eritrean, but we were Black. And that's why they had to sit separately from the bus. They had to cross the street when the Italians were walking down Asmara, right? Like in Asmara. So it's like, I feel like that is probably what it like kind of not helped him, but forced him to acknowledge our Blackness. And I'm grateful to that in some respect, because growing up, I remember him being like, saying things like, oh, I remember like I didn't get a job, one of my first jobs, in an interview. And he said something like, oh, it's probably because you're Black or something like that. Like, and I remember being like, Dad, you can't say that. Like, you shouldn't say that. That's wrong. But like, honestly, like in hindsight, probably like, and I think, you know, I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful that like I didn't have to identify as like Habesha and not Black. And obviously everyone has their own journey and all those things. But it's like one of those things, it's like, I think we are being perceived as being Black, and that is a survival, right? That is for survival. We need to realize, even if that's not who our primary identity, like others will perceive us that way. And like that, it's important to navigate life to understand what that might mean to other people, whether it's negative things, like you were saying, Mary, or positive things.
I just wanted to also add to what you said, Tarhas, because it's really, it's well said. You know, the part where you mentioned, but you know, you're not Black in the sense that like you're better than whatever sort of stereotype conception that they may have, right? Which is hugely problematic to begin with, right? But then there's also the flip side of that too, right? And this is just sort of not the experiences of Ethiopians and Eritreans at all, but this is also experienced by a whole host of, you know, other, of everybody else sort of that I know that's been racialized, right? Which is the understanding of like, how dare you try to be different than what has been categorized for you to be, right? And so we're then sort of going to give you these experiences, these markers that are going to let you know that you're coloring outside of the bounds of where you're supposed to be. So if you don't want to have this kind of an experience where you're hearing these types of things all the time, so to speak, whether that's you're different, or you're different kind of Black, or you know, you're not Black enough, or whatever that may be, depending on who all of this is coming from. In a sense, it could also very well just mean, you know, get back in that stereotypical box that we've defined for you, and perform it, and you'll just be fine in society in that sense, because you're exactly where you're supposed to be, right? So I wonder sometimes if, you know, how people sort of understand that as well, because I've seen that happen to people where it's like the expectation is, do not try to sort of create another way of being, right? And let's continue to sort of homogenize Blackness to mean and show up and look like and be performed in a particular kind of way. Whereas, you know, if you speak to Black people in general, one of the first things you'll hear is sort of the gambit of diversity that exists, and what it means to be Black, and the beauty of it all, and the ways in which it all contributes, right? But it's sort of like this very different way of categorizing and understanding people in a mainstream way, where it's, you know, but you're, as Aaron said, right, like you're not supposed to like classical music. How do you even know about classical music? That's reserved for this particular ethnic group, not for you, right? And other people that we've talked to, that's what they've said. They said, you know, another gentleman, he's a tall Habesha guy, and he was told, you know, don't use those long legs, you know, don't waste it. Go play basketball. And he's absolutely no interest in basketball whatsoever. Doesn't even care for the sport. You know, his interest is in instruments, completely very different, and math, right? But that wasn't something that was encouraged. You know, he was being encouraged to go into another direction. in that sense. So some people sort of coming into is they're coming into a particularly kind of prescribed way of being that also, in some sense, I guess, wonder, what does that interrupt? What does that do to people's own desire to sort of express themselves and their Blackness in whatever way they want without it having been constantly interrupted or some kind of guardrails being put on it?
I'm really curious about where it's coming from. And I feel like it often comes from survival. It's like, don't call it out of the lines because you could get hurt. Don't play classical music because, and I'm not trying to project on your experience, but just, like classical music, because like, that's not where we've succeeded in the past. We've succeeded with basketball, and like, you're more likely to succeed this way. None of those are good things. And those could impede on our futures, like you're saying, Mary. But I feel like it often comes from this like survival, right? Like, and I guess I have empathy for that. And I think there is this experience that a lot of Black people talk about, of like, what does it mean to be Black and why are people stifling me, etc. But I also think it comes from people like trying to protect each other. And that is sometimes like not done in the best way. But I do think it's in many ways, not always, comes from just this need to survive and try to thrive.
Makes sense.
I was just going to say, like, if I could answer your question for a minute, and sorry for jumping in late here, but a defining moment for me growing up, and I grew up in Ethiopia for the most part, but also partly in Asmara because my grandma used to live there. So it was nice to have that world experience to help navigate. So Mary, in answer to your question, I often think about what would have done to me if I'd grown up in North America, like my cousins did. My entire family lived in the States. And I remember one summer going to Virginia very distinctly, and we'd go to the community pool all the time. And my sisters and I never fit in, right? Like, it was this whole population in Fairfax, Virginia, of Black youth and children who'd go there and hang out. And it was always like, where's your accent from? Are you British? And it was like, I have an accent? No, I don't have a British accent because it doesn't sound British, back home. And then the other thing would be like our taste in music, particularly mine, right? So it's funny, Aaron, when you said this the last time too, I remembered thinking about it. It wasn't just classical music, it was also like rock music is out of bounds, right? Like, I like the whole array of music based on what my family listened to, but it was like, you like a lot of white music. And so I was like, oh, what? It's the gamut. But I think it's a really good question that you're asking in terms of what does that do to you growing up, right? Like, how does the hybridity and the constant, in the way that you feel that tension and when you feel the need to either code switch, fit in. But I know for me, like, growing up in both those contexts made me more adamant that I am who I am. And it's like, I don't have to fit into your box. So Tarhas, I really understand your point about survival and thinking about that, because over the years, like the friends that I've made and the genuine connections that I've made, there are certain conversations that have evolved around that. But it's also really interesting because I've also had the experience in recent years in the States, particularly in the southern states, where, I'll go into a restaurant to order something and it'll be like primarily Black staff working there. And I just literally get the rolled eyes, or people will just have an aversion to me. And I can't help but feel it's my difference, right? Like, it's not always the words that are said, it's the way in which you're received or approached. And it's that disdain that you feel when people talk to you. So, I mean, I don't know, I struggle with it, right? Like, I'm always going to give somebody an opportunity or a chance. I'm not going to presume things about you before I know you, but that physical reaction that you get sometimes, or going to the hairdresser. This is my favorite one. Like, because I don't know about you, but in London, Ontario, there aren't too many people that do Black hair. So I remember once upon a time, sitting in queue, and it's always like, you Eritreans and Ethiopians in your natural hair, right? Like, there are always these ways in which the ways we are different are highlighted. And so, I mean, sometimes it is a survival mechanism. Other times I find it's like, what is the purpose, to your question? Why are we fixated on, like, because tell the girl in the mirror she's not Black, good luck, right? Like, I wake up and look at myself. My kids look at me from infancy. They know I'm Black. Like, it's one of the first things they'll point at. Okay.
I have a question. Do you guys we're all in Canada, right? All of us? Yeah. Okay. Just want to make sure. Can't make any assumptions, but, so we're like, do you have I guess I'm 28 now, and I have I've discovered this desire to sort of protect like my traditions and like my culture, and make sure that when I do have kids, like I pass it down. And I'm feeling it in a way that I've never actually felt it before. Do you guys also feel that? Like you, like this other place that you come from, you know, like your roots, like protecting it and like passing it like down. Do you feel like, you mentioned you have kids, like I don't know how you go about doing that?
It's a constant tension. My kids are mixed, so it was really hard. Like they're both from, it's two different ethnicities for them. And I think they know, like I did my PhD in history. They understand some of the tensions that come out. But, you know, it's funny, Mary and I think had a recent conversation. They don't fully belong to either, right? So they find their own ways of belonging. But I have to tell you, I get your desire that you're talking about, because when I was doing oral history interviews and I was having conversations with some of the youth, like it really, some of the conversations I was having with the young women really made me think about the ways I hadn't thought about it before I emerged on the path I was on, right? Like I just assumed like things would just be like, you can pass them on, you figure it out as you go along. We have a lot of intermarriage in my family. And so I learned a great deal of respect through my research for parents that have those conversations with those kids, with their kids, right? Like my parents did not. And I don't fault them for it. It was just the circumstance. Like there were things they would have just taken for granted. But there are things you don't think about as important to you until they are. So learning how to cook the food, right? Like that's important in my household. So eating injera and like having spicy food, tell that to my 5-year-old. But like every other kid knows it's important. It's part of what we do, you know? But it's interesting, and it's a duality because their topographies and geographies and how they grow up, for my kids, is completely different than how I grew up.
What's your kids, their other half, like, if you don't mind sharing?
Oh, it's okay. They're Iraqi, so they're Kurdish, half Kurdish.
Yeah.
So they're distinct, but like my boys look like me, have hair like me. My daughters do not. There's resemblance. So it's always like, it's really interesting, the tensions that come up. So.
Yeah. So the thing about like, it's just that like, yeah, I don't know if you were here, and I think you came in a bit later after I was talking about how I just traveled around the world and like really just like my time in like Africa for a month, just collecting stories. I came back with like this desire to just like incorporate these traditions and cultural practices into my life in a way that I never felt before. Like in my first conversation with Mary and Selam, like we talked about like religion, I think. I vaguely remember, this was like 2020, 2021. I don't know. Like it was a long time ago. Like, very like vague memories.
21.
Okay. But like I think I spoke about how like I grew up painting. And that what that meant was that like everything began and ended with like God. You know, like there was no real actual like focus on like these like traditions and the culture. It was just like God, you know. And then like it's funny because like when I went to Kampala and I was with my cousin, when I spent time with my cousin who's like Orthodox, like he took me to a party. And I was like talking to the ladies there, older women, and they're like, how do you not know this? Oh, like come dance. I was like, I don't know how to iskasta. I grew up Bente, and they all in unison went, ooh, like, you know, like, but like now, like I find that like as I've drifted away from that, like from the religion, I've like sort of like drifted closer to trying to figure out, you know, trying to like closer to my roots, you know? And now I have like that desire to like, I'm trying to like on September 11th, I want to like throw like, getting my mom to teach me how to cook dorowet and like kitfo and like all these different things. I'm going to like try to like feed my friends, you know, I don't know, like there's like this just like, now that I know where my roots are from, like, because for a long time, it was just like, I had like, there was a distance between me and like, you know, the culture and the traditions. But now that I'm like closer to it, like I just want to make sure that I incorporate it into my life and pass it down when I have kids, you know, like it's just like, it's like I'm 28 and that's what I'm thinking about right now. Like, how do I make sure that I keep this like, you know, keep this alive? Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, Henwana, because I you know, I'm having this conversation recently a lot with my partner, Lealem, many of you know, who's Ethiopian and Zeweldi as well. And it's so interesting because we're planning this wedding, and you know, we're going back and forth because my family's Orthodox and his and Day. And, I got to this point where I was like, can't we just not do a religious part and just do a cultural part? And then he was like, well, no, because it's the same thing for us, right? Like our culture and our religion is like one in many ways, right? And it's really, really interesting because it's like, we're trying to balance out these things where it's like we're doing a lot of these Eritrean cultural elements. And so, I'd like to do some Ethiopian cultural elements, but it's kind of like, there's no real tit for tat because a lot of it is really like religiously oriented as well. And it's like so interesting to me because I didn't grow up that way at all. But at the same time, I do think about kids, like you were saying, and I think about how they identify and like, what does it mean? And to your point earlier, like I found growing up a lot of the mixed kids, the ones who were Eritrean and Ethiopian, or, they would just identify as Ethiopian, and mostly because it was easier because most people didn't know where Eritrea was or what Eritrea was. And that's like a huge fear of mine. Like, I do not want my kids to identify as just Ethiopian, preferably Eritrean first and then Ethiopian or both. But yeah, it's so interesting. Like the religion thing is a huge part in like how it impacts the culture as well.
The religion is like, it's a like European like religion. That's how I view Christianity, like it can't, like it's like this it's the faith of the colonizer. That's how I understand it. So like I think it just strips the culture away from, it's like I should say, like, because like Orthodox Christians are also Christians, but like the paint a Christians, I feel like it strips the culture away from the community in a way. I don't know if people agree, but that's what I found growing up. Like now I'm just like listening to all like the Zephen music that I wasn't allowed to listen to like growing up. I'm like, and I come across tracks, I'm like, wow. And then all my friends are like, what, like, this is old, like.
You post Elsa Kirane, and I was like, oh, she's discovering.
I know, like, it's all new to me. Like, it's all new to me.
Look at the joy that you feel though, but that's exciting, right? Like,
yeah.
I don't know about the rest. Like, I have a different experience in many ways because I have to, I think, say for me, growing up in Ethiopia in the 80s in particular, and in the family that I did, Islam and Christianity, like I grew up in a practicing Orthodox Christian home. I learned over time that members of both sides of my paternal and maternal grandmother's side, there's Muslims in each side of the family. There's also Orthodox Christians. So religion was always faith in God, but it was like respect for everyone's religion as well. We went to Muslim weddings, we went to Christian weddings. So I never understood it to be this really rigid line where people had war over it. That was more like, I remember going to an English community school where we had Bible study and imagine like trying to reconcile that with what happens at home. But it's really interesting how over time, if you look historically, the tensions that have risen and the ways in which like what you're talking about, like your lived experience, right? Like my research looks at 1930s, for example, when evangelical Christians really established place in Ethiopian culture, particularly in the South. And it's always very interesting to me over time to see the ways in which that's evolved, right? Like Christianity in Ethiopia and Islam predate the West really making and taking a stakehold within the country. So it's really interesting to learn the ways in which people of different faiths coexisted, like some of the interviews, like so Tarhas, when you're talking about your father's experience, to me, that's like sparking interest because I would love to talk to him, right? Like, because there are ways in which like my grandmother is that generation, right? And that was Asmara for her. And she had a, Muslim father and Christian grandmother. I wouldn't have known any of these things hadn't been for conversation, but the coexistence piece of peoples in the area and culture is something that has been really lost over the last 10 years, I'd have to say. And you see it now more than ever, because it's like that, if you talk to a lot of people of that generation, the ways in which they talk about their neighbors, it's not truly your differences. Like, it's almost like you celebrate your differences. And it's like, so-and-so's music, great. We all eat injera, right? Like there are ways in which people bond over that got really disrupted by, very many real war things and ethnic tensions that did precede that. But it's so interesting, Hermione, when you're saying, I want to discover what my culture is or was, right? Like for the future, because it's, I don't know, like being part Oromo, Eritrean, Ethiopian, like it's a mixed bag. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, it's like, where do you fit on a map?
Mm-hmm. And what I've discovered too is like in asking my, like my family, like like trying to figure out where they're from to figure out where I'm from. Some people can be cagey, depending on like, you know, like there are people in my family that like are half and half. And even now in my basement, I'm whispering because like I know that like, like my mom was like, don't talk about it. But like there's just like, because like, you know, just like different like tensions and whatnot, like back home, like you it's just sometimes people like they don't like what you talk about inside the house, you don't talk about outside. And I even now as I'm answering it, like even from my own mouth, I'm being very vague. I realize that, but like it's just like trying to figure out where you're from. It's really like, and trying to get people to tell you where people in your family tell you where they're from to figure out where you're from. It's like it's not an easy thing. It's like there are these like cultural sensitivities that you have to navigate. You know, yeah. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Oh, of course it makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like I used to ask, because I grew up in a household where like I knew my parents' villages and all this stuff, and I thought it was appropriate to like ask other people their parents' villages. And my parents had to like, they're like, don't do that. You're gonna offend somebody. That's not okay.
Yeah.
You're like, where's your grandmother from? Like, that's not.
That's Tirhas. I discovered that. Like, that's like, because like I would ask that because like I'm new to the whole like figuring out my Eritreanness. But like I'll be asking people that. My Eritrean friends are like, don't ask people what province they're from, because apparently that's not what you can't do that. Like,
yeah,
I didn't know that. You know, like I will proudly say that like, you know, my mom's parents are from Akalaguzai and my dad's parents are from Sarai, but you're not supposed to talk about that. And I just didn't know that. Like, and I don't understand. Like I don't understand in my journey to figure out where people are from. Like there are bits and pieces that you're not supposed to talk about, and I just don't. Like maybe you can like illuminate like and just like explain why, but I just never understood. Like I don't get where that comes from.
Yeah, I mean, I know at least in Eritrea there were regional tensions going back for a very long time, and like being from a certain area meant a particular thing. But you know, it's funny because like my parents, like I said, my dad's particularly old. Like a lot of like what he remembers and even that generation remembers, it's a lot different than even the people coming today, right? So like my dad talks about Eritrea being divided along old lines, right? Whereas now, if you're talking to some of the younger people who are coming now, they don't even like know it that way. They talk about like by Zolbas, for example, and they don't talk about it by like Hamasi, whatever it is. Like, so it's really interesting how like it is like obviously very tense, but also very like it changes from generation to generation as well, like what's appropriate to ask and what's not appropriate to ask. And I really like what you were saying earlier about religion, Nassisse, because I feel like my dad was telling me about how his godfather was Muslim. And how like there was just so much, and they would go to each other's like religious ceremonies like all the time. That's the back home that they grew up with. Yep. And not to jump ships back to religion just because it's just so interesting to me as well, but like this like notion of like, you know, you have your religion and I respect it, and I have my religion and I respect it, and we can celebrate each other's religions, but don't try to convert me, is like so huge for my parents. Like a big deal in their generation. It's like, I can come and celebrate Eid, I can come and celebrate whatever it is you want me to celebrate, but don't disrespect the religion of my forefathers. And I think that for me is what some of the Ente and Orthodox tension has been in recent years, at least from the Orthodox side. I don't know, my partner's Ente, but anyway, sorry, I'm all over the place here, but just everything that you guys are saying is so interesting to me, because obviously I come from my world, but hearing the history of it and hearing your experience as well, Ramona, is just sparking so many thoughts.
Have you guys had that though, like when asking your parents, like, you know, where they're from and, you know, what, you know, maybe like what tribe and whatnot, or like, you know, what village? Do you have people, I know some in the past, we sort of kind of like maybe talked about this, but like, have you had people be like hesitate, your own parents maybe hesitate to tell you, like to give you that information? No?
Oh, I had to fact find. I had to pull information. I have like one aunt on each side that I can pry things out of that are like sacrilegious for anyone else to talk about. So I find them and I source them and I try to ask those questions. But yeah, no, I realized very young, like my father's side being Oromo had tensions that I hadn't picked up on, right? Because of everything else we talked about in terms of people's ethnicities being celebrated. So yeah, there definitely was. And I mean, I knew my mom's side was mixed. I never understood until like we're talking about 5, 6, 7 years ago now that they had connections to Harar region, and that they also have like my paternal grandfather's side were mostly Muslims. Nobody ever talked about that, right? Like it was like a mum situation. It was always embrace other people's religions. What you're saying to us like resonates. We celebrate everybody's everything. We went to everybody's weddings. We did everything, but each had their own line, right? It was really interesting. And so that's what I mean. Like I took that as the norm. Like it's norm practice. But in my adult life, I've come to realize religion is actually a divisive factor in many ways, right? Like, and the cultures and or the practices and things that you hold dear are things you have to realize, are you giving up or not? And what exactly do you hold dear? And asking yourself those hard questions is part of that. Like, I think settling in North America and figuring out who you are and what parts of your culture you wish to retain, right? Like, because there is something to be said for the pluralism in which I grew up with. And I saw it all around me. Like, we're talking like other marriages and whatnot, but I've also seen those marriages that broke down because there were these fundamental differences. And it wasn't the same way as when I grew up, where I understood that so-and-so got married and one's Muslim, one's Christian, they're fine. Like they've been together for 50 years, you know? It's not that anymore. Like that doesn't work that easily. So it's really interesting. I don't know. I think you raised some really interesting questions, and it would be really, because I think the North American context also compounds these differences in different ways. Like there are things that are just the norm back home that nobody would bat an eye at, or were when I was growing up. I should actually contextualize that because it's now a historical thing and it's evolved, right? Like, and I see that.
Anybody else, like in terms of like trying to pull information from your parents?
I feel like for my parents, they'll never open up and just be like, let me tell you a story about this. But if I have the questions and I like push, then they'll very much tell me. Actually, mostly my mom. My dad like just pretends he doesn't remember anything and just pushes me towards my mom. But my mom's been really one of the main anchors of like understanding my family history and understanding who I am as an Abasha person or as an Ethiopian person. It's really surprising because my my cousin Lealem's Tirhas's fiance husband, it's so interesting because at some points we'll like every few years we'll like connect and be like, okay, what part of the family history have you learned and like what have you uncovered and things like that. And I remember like knowing very well that we have like some Oromo mixture in our blood, and like Lealem had just figured that out. And he's like, how did I not know this? I'm like, how did you not know that? Like, I don't even know how you didn't know this. Like, it's how. So it's interesting how for some people it could be very like secretive, and for others it could just be even in the same family.
But you know, like I defy anyone to try and find any family that doesn't have a mixture. Like if you're from that region, I would love to know any family that's like purely any one thing. It's hard. Like try to find that person. It is so hard. So it's really interesting the ways in which these tensions have come arise like over the last few years, because if you go back in your lineage, it doesn't take more than a parent or a grandparent to find a branch that's connected to some tribe somewhere that's got links. It won't be that hard, you know? So it's so interesting because to purely and definitively say I'm just one thing, I don't know if you can find anyone who can do that. I really defy.
Honestly, you need to meet my parents because they will very proudly tell you that they are nothing but pure to me. Like, you need to meet them.
Okay, fair.
No, listen, I'm not saying you're not wrong. You might be right. I'm just saying if you meet them.
No, I can relate. I have those on my side too, hence why I was saying I'll find everyone else. But you know, it was really, like I said, it was interesting to me to find out like my links to like central Ethiopia when I was under the impression that we were on my mother's side from one side or the other, right? But I just think over the years, like families were much bigger too, and the branches spring out.
And then also it's all paternal, right? That's what drove me crazy. Like you only ever follow the father's line. It's like there are all these women that came from different villages. Like where did they all come from? You know what I mean? Like at least for me, like when my parents, they're able to recite their lineage really far back and learning to do the same, but it's the paternal. So I'm like, well, where was she from? And they're like, oh, this village over here. Okay, but where was her family?
That's so true.
Thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed part 1 of this episode titled, Seriously Though, Where Are You From? Neither here nor there. Join us next week for part 2. See you then. The Kümneger Talks podcast has been brought to you by Selam, Abebe, Mary Goitom, and Nassisse Solomon. Our theme music has been provided by the talented Lealem Abebe. Our sound design is the amazing Zeweldi, and all the artwork has been created by the lovely Dagmawit Worku.